Hey, it seems recently that a certain red-faced sweaty cop channel made a very uninformed video about the SIG P320. You know, and a little bit alarmist, scary video about how, ooh, are they going off in holsters? And, ooh, are they safe? I don't know. Don't think I'd carry mine. Would you carry yours? You know, one of those guys that tries to make you think that they're all pro-gun and on your side, even though in their professional life they willingly enforce anti-gun laws and unconstitutional laws. But what I'm dealing with right now today is his issue with the 320. Because he made this video, a lot of people sent me emails saying, hey, we would like the perspective of someone who might actually know how a gun works, because it appears he does not. And I agreed, yeah, it does not appear he knows how guns work based on what he was saying in his video. So I thought I'd make a video today addressing the issues about the SIG P320 and whether they are safe or not. Now, first I'm going to say I don't have a dog in this race because I don't even own a SIG P320. I think they're great guns, but I have no desire to have one. So, you know, I'm not saying they're bad. If you have one, great. And if you want one, get one. But I don't want one, don't have one. So I have no reason to defend them. But I do not like it when people say stuff that's just not true and when they help anti-gunners in their agenda. And you might say, well, how are they helping anti-gunners in their agenda? Well, we'll get to that here in a minute. Basically, in his video, he talks about the three issues with the SIG P320. I always want to say PIG 320. I always want to shorten it. So if I say PIG 320, you know what I'm talking about. In the video, he talks about how the gun can fire when dropped, how the gun can fire when bashed in the back by a hammer, you know, like in a lot of those videos. I'm not sure if he specifically mentioned that, but that was one of the things that was in a lot of the videos where they were talking about drop fire, the gun. So those two issues right there, firing when dropped and firing when getting smashed in the back by a hammer, which I don't know how that ever became a thing, but it did. A lot of channels wanting to get views, I guess. And a third issue that his video is mainly about is about a lawsuit filed against SIG by people who say the gun went off in the holster. It just went off in the holster. Well, that part's fucking ridiculous, and we'll talk about that at the end here. But the first things I want to talk about are the gun firing when dropped and the gun firing when bashed in the back of the slide by a hammer. Because those things can happen, or at least they could, the way the old gun was designed. And the problem was the mass of the trigger. Now you might wonder, well, how does the mass of the trigger cause this problem? Well, simple. It's Newton's first law. I think most of you know Newton's first law. It's that law that states, you know, an object in motion tends to stay in motion, and an object at rest tends to stay at rest until they are acted upon by an outside unbalanced force. And by unbalanced force, it means the force has to be either great enough to overcome their mass if they're at rest, or, you know, great enough to overcome their inertia if they're moving. And because of this, the mass of the trigger played a big role. To understand this, let's look at an illustration of the gun here. Now, this is not a fancy illustration. This is just something I drew real quickly. So the internals, which I'm going to show you now, are not actually representative of the actual pieces. This is to just give you an idea of how things work in the most simplified manner I possibly can. Basically, when you pull the trigger, there's two stages on a striker-fired trigger. There's take-up and there's break. During the take-up, that's when most safeties are removed. Firing pin blocks, other types of striker safeties, etc. When you pull the trigger back to the break point, that's when you're actually making it to where the striker can move. So let's say once this little lever goes above the red line right here, that means that firing pin is now free to move. That striker is free to move. And like I said, that is actually moved during the take-up process of the trigger, and then after that is done, the trigger breaks, releases the striker, the gun fires. And while you have the gun in your hand, you need to do both of those things. You have to take up the slack, which removes the safety, and then you actually have to pull the trigger to where it breaks, which removes the sear, and the striker moves forward. But under some circumstances, the gun can fire without doing that final step of the trigger, without actually breaking the trigger and disengaging the sear. Now, it cannot happen without the first stage happening, you know, the take-up and removing the safety, but like I said, it can happen without actually breaking the trigger fully. First off, let's look at the gun if it's falling to demonstrate this point. If the gun is falling, that gun has energy. It's in motion. It has inertia. Well, as it falls, it strikes the ground. Well, it doesn't have enough energy to overcome the ground and move the ground, so it stops. It's stopped dead. But the gun and the trigger are two separate things. They can move independently of each other. They have to be able to actually function. So that trigger also has inertia. And the trigger does not strike the ground. The striking of the ground is what stops the gun. The actual spring and the firing mechanism of the trigger is what stops the actual trigger from moving. And unfortunately, when the trigger was larger and had more mass, that spring and that mechanism was not strong enough to overcome the inertia of the trigger. The trigger continued moving slightly, which disengaged the safety mechanism, and then the impact of the gun hitting the ground actually jars loose the sear, allowing the striker to go forward and fire the gun. That's what happens when you drop the gun, causing it to fire. The old design, the trigger had too much mass and was allowed to keep traveling. It overcame that spring tension, and then the gun could fire. Now that you understand that, let's also look at hitting it in the back with a hammer, because that's the same thing, but kind of the opposite thing. In this case, the gun and the trigger as separate entities are at rest. That means they're going to have to be acted upon by outside energy that is great enough to move them. Well, surprise, surprise, bashing the back of the gun with a hammer is enough to move the gun. But like I said, the trigger is also stationary in this scenario, and it has to have energy enacted upon it to overcome the fact that it is at rest. And since it isn't being struck by the hammer, it has to be overcome by the spring and the trigger mechanism of the actual gun. And since that was not strong enough to overcome the mass of the trigger, it would not move the trigger until the trigger got to where it hit the break point. That was strong enough to overcome the mass of that trigger, making it move. Then it continued forward with the gun. But because it had actually moved back to the break point, well, that firing pin or that striker could be dislodged by the energy of the hammer hitting the back of the gun. And since the safety mechanism was now disengaged, that gun could fire. So in the end, you can see the problem was very simple. It was the trigger had too much mass and the spring was too light to either overcome the inertia of the trigger when it's in motion or to make the trigger move when it's at rest. So therefore, they needed a lighter trigger or a stronger spring or a combination of both. They solved this problem. It's no longer an issue. Now, like I said, I don't understand why some gun channels were more than happy to help the leftist groups who like to sit and try to create ways guns can misfire or be deemed unsafe just so that they can damage the manufacturers. But a lot of them, I guess they're willing to do that for views. I personally am not willing to do that, so I'm just going to deal with the facts of the why the gun actually fired when it was dropped or beat with a hammer. Now, I do want to add one little disclaimer here to the video real quickly. Do not drop your gun and do not bash it with a hammer. Those are not good ideas to do with any gun. So even if you have a gun that isn't a SIG P320 or a PIG 320, do not do either of those things. It is not a good idea. At least don't do them intentionally. All right, now let's deal with the thing that I said is completely fucking ridiculous, and that is the idea that the guns are going off in the holsters. If you actually pay attention to the lawsuit, and the lawsuit is filed mostly by police officers, if you pay attention to the suit, the guns aren't going off when they're just on someone's hip in a holster. If that was true, with the number of police officers and the number of people carrying PIG 320s around these days, we'd be seeing people hopping up and down at the bus stop as their gun goes off. We're not seeing that. In every one of the cases, the gun and the holster were in someone's hand. They had taken it off their belt, they had taken it off their body, they had it in their hands, they had it sitting on a table, etc. when it went off. They were fidgeting with it. And I don't know about you, I don't often fidget with a loaded gun in the holster just sitting around, because it's not a safe thing to do. You can get your finger between that trigger as you're reholstering it, a part of the holster can get into that trigger as you're reholstering it, anything can happen. That's not a smart thing to do. And that's what they were all doing when their guns went off. Why did they have their holster and their gun in their hands? It's pretty obvious that what happened is user error, a bunch of careless people engaged in unsafe activity, and they had a negligent discharge. Now you might say, well, how are they suing people then if it's a negligent discharge? Well, there's one reason especially, and that is because of lawyers. And lawyers will sue for two reasons. One, they just love money and they think gun manufacturers have deep pockets and they don't care if the people were actually negligent or not. They just hope the gun companies will settle and give them some money. Or two, they are activist lawyers on the left who want to damage gun companies and damage the Second Amendment, and they can do that by trying to drive companies out of business with frivolous lawsuits. So they take the case. And as far as the people, mostly police officers, who had the issue with the gun, well, a lot of times they injured themselves or they injured someone else, and they don't want to take responsibility for that. Especially since a lot of them are like, I'm a cop, I'm super trained, I know what I'm doing. Oh, and by the way, I know this is not a SIG P320 because I don't own one. Like I said, I'm just giving you an example with this. But that being said, like I say, the cops say, I'm super trained and I would never make that kind of mistake. And part of it's their pride, and the other part is, if they have to take the blame themselves and not be able to blame it on a gun that just went off on its own, well, then they would have to take liability if they harmed someone else, liability if they had a negligent discharge with their gun at work, or their insurance wouldn't pay if they injured themselves because it's self-inflicted injury. So they have a vested interest in saying, oh, the gun just went off by itself. But here's the thing. People who know how guns work don't believe them. Unfortunately, a lot of juries don't know how guns work. A lot of judges don't know how guns work, and lawyers don't care. They just care about settlements. So they take these types of incidences and they try to turn them into things that are bigger than they actually are. They take people who did something irresponsible with their guns and try to make them look like victims. And those people are more than willing to look like victims rather than take responsibility for their own actions. So that's the story. Like I said, if you've got a Pig 320, don't worry about it. If you've got the old style trigger, switch it out to the new style trigger. Send it in, get it done, whatever, if you're worried about dropping your gun. If you're worried about bashing it with a hammer, just don't, and that solves that problem. And as far as them going off in holsters, that doesn't happen. It hasn't happened. These are just bullshit lawsuits filed by people who don't want to take responsibilities for their own actions. And like I said, I don't understand why some gun channels are willing to help them, but often it's gun channels, like I say, that, they pretend to be all pro-gun and everything else, but in their daily profession, they more than willingly enforce unconstitutional gun laws. So I never understand where they're coming from. But like I said, don't drop your gun. If you are going to drop it, get that trigger fixed. Don't bash it with a hammer. And as far as it going off in holsters, it ain't happening. So don't worry about it. Hey, this is the Yankee Marshal, just reminding everyone out there that if you disagree with anything I say in any one of my videos, be it something political or tactical, I am going to give you the opportunity to come talk to me face to face instead of just having to put stuff in comment sections where someone might not even read them. You can come in one of my live chats and tell me off in person. You just have to send an email to shootingleftofcenter@gmail.com, and in the subject line of that video put slap the yank, and then I will get back with you and set up a time where you can come in one of the live chats and tell me off face to face.